Welcome back, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to Wednesday at NICO. Oh, yeah, great. It's my pleasure and honor and pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker, Professor Ágnes Horvát, from School of Communication at Northwestern. And Ágnes, coming from physics, Ágnes has been truly wonderful in many different ways, but I would like to say like her research has been at the really forefront of computational social science, and her research on the let me just see my note. So interdisciplinary, very truly interdisciplinary, working on communication and scientific communication, and it made a huge impact on our understanding of how our attention has been shaped across many different platforms. It was just so amazing how data was treated and analyzed, and we got to understand how our communication has been shaped and shaping our attention. And her recent research on also on how dissemination of scientific outcomes is subject to bias, I suppose is a part of things her passion is now about. She'll be sharing it. So today, I guess she's going to share her recent passion and excitement of her research on how network bias academic communication online. So please join me in welcoming our distinguished speaker, Ágnes Horvát. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hei-Jin. As always, it's an honor to be here. Many of you know, maybe those who are new or don't know it, but I did a postdoc here at NICO, so this is such a wonderful place for me to return to, even though it's just a few buildings away. But I value this community. The time that I spent as a postdoc was transformational for my research, and I hope it will be for yours as well. So it is a great pleasure and truly a delight to be here and talk to you. As Hei-Jin prefaced it, something that I got interested in a few years ago, and that is scholarly communication. How is science communicated on the web? On the one hand by scientists, but then on the other hand by other stakeholders, members of the public, practitioners. We see some bot activity. So there are many stakeholders that talk about science now on the web. And I want to preface this discussion. I want to make sure that I mention that it will have a network component, something all of you are very interested in. So networks are a framework that we are oftentimes using to understand the complexities of the world, but it has also focus on science and research. And that's, of course, another thing that is very close to home to all of you in this audience, I think. Okay, so let's start by just looking a little bit at how science is done and what our conceptions are about us being scientists, us doing research. And I'd like to invite you just first off to think about your personal science journey and maybe pinpoint one moment that was a milestone that you feel like made you become a scientist, or think of yourself as a scientist. Do you have it? I see some smiles. I think that's a good sign. So for me, this can be way back. For me, this was in high school. So I think all of you will have something like that. And if I'm correct, my assumption is that you will have thought now of a moment that was curiosity driven, where you were challenging yourself to understand better a problem, to seek a new way to look at it, to seek tools, whether those were mathematical, analytical tools, computational tools, whatever, to understand that problem better. Now, I will argue that, and I will rely there on 30-year-old philosophy of science work on the contrast between the normal science, this curiosity-driven, this very productive intellectual pursuit, and the post-normal science that I feel like we are increasingly becoming aware of. And I will invite you now to do a second thing and think about maybe a responsible science journey, or a moment in your trajectory where you felt like the science you are doing, the research you are doing has to be responsible, in addition to being rewarding for yourself, rewarding for a narrow scientific community. To me, that came much later. So I will be very honest, and then the invitation is out there to spend a moment on thinking about when that happened to you, if at all, and it's never too late. But if at all. I will say that for, and this is again an untested hypothesis, and I will not ask input here so that we do run an unofficial survey, but my hunch is that for some of you, the younger student generation here, those two might have been fairly close to each other, while for us, for the not so young ones, those two might be further apart. And the reason this is important is because increasingly, and the pandemic has shown us a good example for how science needs to interact more and needs to react quickly to what's going on in society. This is shaping our understanding about what the responsibilities of science are and how we should approach the scientific enterprise. And just again, relying on this more philosophical work, they highlight the importance of this in the post-normal science era, the importance of a few characteristics. One of them being that the facts that would be scientifically proven seem to become uncertain. There are very important values in dispute. The stakes are high, and the decisions are urgent. So all of these are easily understood if you think of the COVID pandemic as one example. Another example could be climate change and the related environmental risks. Now, this work and this sentiment that hopefully some of you share highlight the importance of doing science in a way that engages with extended peer communities. So not just within a very narrow group of scholars, but engaging communities that might have input for that particular problem. It has a component around the democratization of science, so including more diversity in terms of who gets to do science. And then it focuses once again on the quality control aspect of this. How do we handle misconduct? How do we handle mistakes, even honest mistakes? So how are we faring in our research along these dimensions? And so much of the work that I have done recently tries to pay attention to those criteria, and we are far from having done this perfectly. But I propose some solutions and some frameworks that are dealing with these questions and are approaching this in a data-driven way. So just to anchor this science on the web concept, this phenomena, at the very beginning, I want to mention some surveys that have been done in the past decade. On the one hand, we see that researchers are very active in online spaces. 75 to 80% of them use some type of social media for the dissemination and promotion of their work. This sort of activity is increasingly being used in the evaluation of scholars. On the other hand, it's not just the scholars who promote their work, it's also the public that gets information about science from these online platforms. So more than half of the US population has cited online platforms as the primary source for science and technology information. And then of course, journalists use these mentions of science to understand what to cover and what to promote further via the more traditional media sources. So one wants to study this phenomena, which is quite ubiquitous on various platforms, then there are two approaches that have been fairly established. One of them is the more survey-based industry reports, something that, I don't know, the Pew Research Center would do. And that's one important step, one approach. Another approach is the one that is focused more, it's more qualitative, it's focused on science and technology studies, or it comes out of that angle. It might incorporate communication theories. But there's a huge gap between these that I feel like needs to be tackled and filled, and that's the area of the empirical analysis of large-scale behavioral data. And this will sound very familiar to those of you who are regulars here, because this is something that that many of us are very interested in doing. So when I speak about large-scale empirical analyses, I also understand here a few connections that become important when we are trying to understand how science is disseminated on the web. So on the one hand, we can learn quite a bit from human-computer interaction research. This is the area of computer science that studies the design of platforms and the affordances built in those platforms that will shape how people engage with them and how they can, even in principle, share science on them. Sociology of science has important lessons for us in terms of how scientific norms, institutions are shaping these processes. Sociology in just more broadly, talking about status, demographics, group dynamics, and so on. And something that, I'm finding increasingly interesting is the civic science movement, which is trying to connect, again, lay audiences, typically considered lay audiences, and scientists to find ways that there is mutual interaction and mutual benefit on both ends. So in this spirit, I will preface this with a question. Most of the projects that I will talk about will try to somehow hang on to this big question. Can the networks of the spread of scientific articles in online spaces on various platforms be used to improve science communication, on the one hand for researchers, for the research community, but on the other hand, for society at large? So can it have that opening and potentially an impact on those communities? And so far, having done this for, I don't know, 3-4 years, I can say possibly yes, but we are making more and more progress, and that's exciting. So the few things that I want to mention, and I'll be quite superficial just to give you a wide range of projects, and I'm happy to go into details towards the end of the presentation so that we talk about the things that are most interesting and most exciting for you. I'm going to talk a little bit at the beginning about social biases and the visibility of research online and the impact of scholars as it results from that visibility and it results from the other components of their scientific production. We are going to talk about gender biases. We are going to talk about self-promotion per se, and we are going to talk about intersectional teams, so teams that have both gender diversity and ethnic diversity. We are going to try to look at this pipeline where there's a certain scientific production. We will characterize the teams that produce science, write those articles. We are going to look at how they are visible on various platforms, starting from social media, all the way through blogs, news, and so on. And then we are also going to take a look at how that translates into traditional impact quantified by citation. So we are going to see some components along that pipeline. Then in the second part, we are going to talk a little bit about how potentially harmful science is shared. And by potentially harmful here, I mean retracted research in particular. We looked at the type of online attention that retracted articles receive and have some interesting findings there that are absolutely worthy of further thinking and could have important policy implications. I'll talk a little bit about what kind of communities are engaged with that. I think that's important because it's not just the scientists who see the retracted research online. We are in social media spaces where lay audiences have access to that information. I think that's really important. And then we are going to conclude by thinking a little bit more about this multi-platform, multimodal aspect of science communication. And we are going to see how that leads to information loss. We are going to try to track that across multiple platforms. So this is going to be a fast-paced talk, but I'll jump right in so that we can have some time for discussion. So no news on this slide. I will just say that there is ample research to document wide-ranging gender and racial ethnic inequalities in science. Some of these are more recent, others have been around for a while. So the disparities have been documented essentially throughout the entire pipeline, starting from resources, earnings, through speaking engagements, promotion, recognition, visibility, and so on. Now, why is this important? There's all this research that shows that there are these disparities, but I think when we want to assess the importance of this work, then we got to think about the societal costs of the lacking diversity, whether that's gender diversity or racial ethnic diversity. We know that women, just as an anecdote, have been diagnosed with heart disease because for quite some time. It wasn't simply understood what are the symptoms of heart attack in women, and they are different than in men. Similarly, there is ample research to show that people of color are at higher risk, even when it comes to quite fundamental medical interventions, simply because we don't quite understand how they would react to certain treatments. There's no data to do that. Now, the benefits of gender and racial ethnic diversity in science are also unquestionable. We have building and mounting research on the fact that female members increase the overall team intelligence. Gender heterogeneous scientific teams are more creative. They also produce higher impact research, and the same has been found for ethnically diverse teams. Now, addressing the gender gap in recognition, I will argue that is essential in closing the gender gap that could then lead to more diverse topics being discussed and more stakeholders being served, for instance, by healthcare research. So visibility is a component that is a prerequisite for recognition. So you cannot recognize someone's work who you are not aware of. So the basic argument is that there's going to be a necessary visibility before that recognition can happen. And many have argued that actually visibility in online spaces can fill that gap. Visibility can be increased because there are fewer gaps that one needs to, or fewer barriers that one needs to overcome to be active as a researcher in online spaces. So based on this prior work, I will say that the study of online visibility or success should be critical in addressing the gap in recognition. Now, how do we look at this visibility empirically? We built a data set that starts out with a platform called Altmetric. Many of you might be familiar with this. It contains online mentions of research articles on various types of platforms. That enables us to create basic time series on various sources that cover research, so that for each article we can track their mentions and their visibility. We have quite a few of these, so we are looking at all sorts of research domains, areas, and close to a 10-year time frame. We aggregate to this data, or we append to this data on historical co-authorship networks. So many of you might have seen the Open Academic Society's data, and then also the Web of Science data that has a lot of meta information in terms of citations, in terms of topics, in terms of subfields. Okay, so with this data mashup, we can start to ask then questions like, how well is female scholars' work represented? And what we find is here on the left for 2017 that side of psychology, where 52% of the scholars whose work is mentioned online are women. All other areas have a lower representation. Some are actually quite far from the 50%. You might immediately argue, yeah, but in most of there are no 50% women to begin with. So when we compare the representation online with the actual representation in Web of Science, so in terms of who is publishing to begin with, then we see that even compared to that, so that's the dotted line, the visibility is lower. And it's the lowest in chemistry based on this data and this year's sample, followed by things like biological sciences, physics, and so on. Now, you might also ask, okay, so this is overall everyone who's publishing. Maybe women who are very successful have a higher visibility. On the contrary, what we see is that there is an important glass ceiling effect. So on the rightmost part of the chart here, I'm showing you in the bar the percentage of women who are publishing. So that's the salmon colored bar. And then the top 25% are shown with a cross here, and top 15%, top 10, or top 5 and top 1%. So you see that the representation of women in those increasingly selective success groups is lower and lower. We have not only fewer women based on the full output, based on who's publishing, but as we go higher up in terms of who's the most visible, we see lower and lower representation. Now, what are the characteristics of scientific production that might predict visibility and success in these spaces? Prior research tells us that scientific impact, so prior impact, if you were an important or a highly regarded scholar in your area, then you will have a benefit from that. Your visibility will be higher. Social capital, gender type formation and collaborations, all these can contribute to that. So what we do is to build models based on these and similar variables that we'll try to use to explain visibility and then see differences between men and women. So scientific impact, we had a variable group that included productivity, age index, the impact factor of the journal, whether it was a high impact journal or not, the popularity of the topic, so on. And then we had some network-based measures, some that we grouped in the social capital category that included the number of collaborators in a given year, the density of the ego network, the team size, so how large were the teams that the person worked in. And then what we call here network femaleness and maleness, how likely were they to work with other women, other men, and how strong were the ties. So how frequently they work with those scholars. So just to show you one set of results here. The models are run separately for different areas. What we find here is that basically in almost all cases, these features, the scientific impact, the social capital, the network femaleness, maleness, will be more strongly associated with the success of men than women. So that's what you see here, for instance, in the social capital case for agricultural sciences. The higher your social capital, whatever was in that group of variables, the more likely that you will have a high online visibility. For women, actually, the higher social capital you have along those measures, the less likely it is that you are going to be in a high visibility category. So for women in general, most of these features are either have a negative impact, a significant negative impact, or not significant, or essentially, yeah, around the zero. There's no effect. And that's striking and interesting, because what this tells us is that based on these factors, we can probably recommend strategies for men to increase their visibility, online visibility, but we cannot do the same for women. And I think that's an important takeaway, something that we should be working on, but where we feel like the factors that are related to women's online visibility are so unique, so diverse, that that we have a hard time to give suggestions that that hold across areas. Yeah. They are not exactly reciprocal because we don't have the gender label for everyone. So we have for 20% of the data, we had unknown genders. So the certain teams had more unknowns. We know that these labeling algorithms are notoriously bad for Asian names, where the name is certainly not indicative of gender. So we have that strong imbalance there, and we do see that. So the actual features are quite similar. So it's number of articles in women majority teams, men majority teams, the homophily, and that. Sure. Feel free to interrupt if there are questions. I think that's.
it is known that women tend to be, there is a high chance that they will be treated very poorly in online media, right? So disparaging comments, kind of very aggressive behavior. And I wonder if that's one of the things that you are seeing, that it's sort of, it's not that there could be strategies that could increase their visibility, but the fact that overall it's just not a good thing to do, because yeah, I could increase my visibility, but I will have a huge amount of abuse, and I really don't want to put myself through that. Is there any way to kind of get at that aspect?
Yeah, so excellent question. I couldn't agree more with that. And this triggered our next question that was around self-promotion. So do women self-promote much less than men, which could explain some of these differences in visibility, and could be due to the fact that these environments are not exactly welcoming, equally welcoming for every group. And yes, you are perfectly correct. I'll jump over this just to get to the point that hopefully gets closer to answering your question. So we were interested in, where does this gap in visibility, this seemingly large gap, come from? The one component of this is self-promotion, where women have some agency, and the other one is the bias in sharing. And we see evidence of both on the one hand, but then the first component that addresses your question is this difference in self-promotion, and that's huge. And it holds across areas. This is work actually done with Hao Peng, who's in the room and who can tell you even more about this. But when we control for things like journal impact, affiliation prestige, author productivity, everything that you can think of, the difference is very, very significant. I'm showing you here results for 2018. We have the same results for 5 years, including 2018, and the trend has not changed. Women are just not ready to put themselves out there. And there are good reasons in the literature on online harassment and literature on backlash. So a lot of times when women engage in behaviors that are not gender conforming, they get a backlash that can be quite penalizing. So let me just show you these figures in terms of the differences in self-promotion. I think the trends, so there is a gender gap in all of these cases, quite universal, but I think the trends are also very interesting and give some takeaways for all of us in terms of thinking about self-promotional efforts, regardless to what extent we want to put ourselves out there. So when it comes to journal impact factors influence on the predicted self-promotion probability, we see that people are more likely to promote their high impact research than their low impact research. Interestingly, the gap for low impact research is smaller, orders of magnitude smaller than the one for high impact research. When it comes to affiliation rank, so here are the highly ranked universities, the not so highly ranked universities over there, we see that there's a difference, but that difference is quite stable for men and women. So that doesn't seem to have a gendered component per se, in addition to, again, there being a gender gap. And then when it comes to previous numbers of publications, then we see that there's a sweet spot. People in their mid-careers tend to promote the most. People early on probably still suffering from the imposter syndrome, not that anyone would know that here. They tend to promote less, and then after a while, there's just probably not as much benefit, so not as much investment. So this is interesting and quite universal, and it relates to some degree to this question about, or invites this question about why we think that there's this very stark difference. It also tells us that we want to be very cautious when we evaluate research using proxies in online spaces. Okay, now another thing that people do when it comes to evaluating research is to think about citations. Those are the classical examples of quality and impact in research. A lot of research shows that that's also biased, both for gender minorities and ethnic racial minorities. What I'm showing you here is just a model result. This is a partial result. We have a lot of other variables, but these are the key things that I'd like you to pay attention to. What we are trying to look at here is this longer pipeline. So diversity in the team, both gender and ethnic diversity. We are looking at online visibility, and then we are looking at citations. We are trying to predict here the being in the top 25% of most cited papers. And the variables are as follows. One thing that we see is online visibility being more and more important over the years. Another thing that I'm showing here is years through from 2013 to 2019, and the more recent the data, the more recent the trend, the stronger association between online visibility. Remember this factor that is already biased, and citations, another thing that we find to be biased. Now, when it comes to gender diversity separately, we see that gender diversity has a growing positive effect. It was quite exciting for us. When it comes to ethnic diversity, we see a varying positive effect. So both of these were to some extent encouraging. When we looked at the intersectional component of this, so the combination of gender and ethnic diversity, then we see a growing intersectional penalty. So this is the timeline. So the more recent the data we look at, the higher the intersectional penalty. This is something that we find quite concerning. So to summarize this part of the talk, and I'm really happy to talk about all the details in the Q&A, we do see that science's gender gap persists online in this online visibility. Male researchers dominate the mentions. One component of this is that women self-promote less, and there are important reasons for that. And we also see a translation to citations that is penalizing ethnically and gender diverse needs. Yeah.
I would just make a recommendation. I think that sometimes when we phrase things, we are perpetuating problem. So women self-promote less would appear as if this is woman's choice.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, you know, I've seen harassment of female academics on Twitter, and I know it's not a choice, because why would you put yourself through it?
Yeah.
So I think that maybe this could be expressed as women are not allowed to self-promote as much, which actually puts the onus of the issue where it is, not on women's ability to do something, but the fact that they actually are not able to do something. And so I know I'm being preachy, but
no, I completely agree with this, and this is an important component here, because this is the piece that is hopefully, fingers crossed, close to to publication, and I think we want to be extra careful of the point that you are raising. I also want to be very cautious when we signal through these sentences some action. I think in many cases the majority group is not actively trying to push down the minority, but the question is quite complex, and so suggesting so the victim blaming is absolutely something we want to stay away from. So yeah. Other questions? Okay, then let me go through very quickly at this point, I'll just highlight the few things for further reading if you are curious. So we investigated retracted research. Academic retractions are not very common, but typically highly visible. They are science's way to self-correct. It's an important problem because prominent journals, it's not just a problem of low quality journals and outlets. Prominent journals are as likely to publish retracted work as less prominent ones. And this work, the retracted findings, the false findings, can have a substantial effect on the public's knowledge about scientific matters and the perception of how serious academia is and where their tax money is potentially going. One component of the retracted work literature that is very that is understudied is this idea of online attention to retracted articles, and this is the part that our team tried to tackle in more depth. On the one hand, we asked what kind of online attention do retracted articles receive, and on the other hand, we also asked, is the retraction effective at decreasing the attention to harmful articles? The setup is quite similar to what we had in the prior study. We have data across various different platforms from Altmetrics, and we collaborated with Retraction Watch, the most comprehensive collection of retracted articles. We matched the two. We built just so that we understood how retracted articles were shared. We built a control set of control papers that were similar along multiple dimensions to retracted research, and then we monitored their sharing patterns, their mentions as well. So the first thing that I'll try to convince you of is that retracted articles are more popular after publication. This is way before anyone knows that the paper will be retracted. We see that across all sorts of platforms that we study. We even went back and looked at the most prestigious news outlets, and they have the same trends as general news media as well. So this is a problem because this means that potentially false findings are reaching broader audiences, more people. Now, when we ask the second question, does the retraction decrease the attention to harmful articles? Across all these platforms, we see that actually the retraction comes too late to be effective in causing any significant reduction in attention. Notice here the large error bars, and these are teeny tiny numbers. So if you do an interrupted time series analysis, you realize that there's actually no reduction of attention. What this means is that by the time the retraction comes, people are aware of the flawed nature of the results. One positive thing, and this was quite surprising to me as someone who's not a huge fan of using social media. On Twitter, we saw that after publication, there was more uncertainty, there was more skepticism towards subsequently retracted articles than towards the control papers. And this is interesting because this means that there are on academic Twitter voices that are able on the one hand to flag these problems and on the other hand to voice these problems. And I think this is quite encouraging given all the things that we saw that were not great news. Okay, so why is this a problem? Just to mention one last thing, if one tries to, by a semi-automated way, to see what types of users are engaging with retracted work, what we see is that the public is much more likely to share, mention retracted articles than non-retracted articles, and practitioners have the same tendency. These are mainly health practitioners, given how we do the labeling. You will see here a difference in terms of bots, but actually bots are helpful in this context. They promote the fact that the paper has been retracted. So they are here in this context, a good occurrence. What I'm concerned about is the tendency for the public and practitioners who will not see the retraction notice or a retraction flag on the publication page. So they have no ability currently to hear about the fact that this research has been retracted. So that's problematic. Yes.
Oh.
Yeah.
Sorry for keeping interrupting. So I know that there are some retracted papers that are particularly influential. So the stuff related to the link between autism and vaccines, for instance, something like that. And so I wonder to what extent one or two cases like those would actually be changing some of the statistics on these because they are so extreme, right? I mean, there is an entire industry of paranoid people on the vaccine issues.
Yet another excellent question. So the distribution, the attention distribution for retracted work is very skewed. So there are a few examples of papers that have been, like the Wakefield paper, that have been mentioned over and over again and used and misused. So that's true. Even if we drop those very few cases, the results are still in favor of the retracted work. Yes.
I have a couple questions online.
Sure.
Neil Ormos asks, excuse me, does the high level of attention to a paper at least partially explain its retraction? Is high citation impact and public attention the route by which defective papers receive attention from other researchers who notice the defects in a way that eventually produce the retraction?
Yes, absolutely. So the what I had on the slide is visibility leads to scrutiny, and we are very, very much aware of that mechanism where there are probably far more bad papers and misleading papers out there that never get retracted for the precise reason that the commenter is mentioning, that they never get enough attention to discover those problems. From our perspective, those papers that don't get any visibility are not spreading misinformation to the public. So we are not concerned about those, but absolutely that's a mechanism. So if you pass a threshold of visibility, you are more likely to trigger that scrutiny that could get you into trouble if you falsify the data and things like that. Yeah.
And then one more question from Emma. Do you have insights into the migration or lack thereof of academic Twitter to Mastodon or other platforms recently?
Oh, I'd love to look into that, but we don't have that sort of, the Mastodon data is something that's lacking. And I agree with the question. I think one way to, so the more you look at this data, the more you see the problems that stem from the fact that Twitter and most of the social media platforms that we are using were not developed for science dissemination. We just adapted them to try to do this new thing. And that is a losing proposition in many ways. So a counter proposition could be, yeah, let's just do this from scratch. Let's make sure that we have those safeguards in place. Let's just rethink how helpful social media for science could look like. And I think there's a super interesting case where yeah, I'm sure most of you know, with the leadership change at Twitter, a lot of people were very interested in just doing that extra effort and building up their network and learning the affordances of this new platform. So I'd love to study that, but I don't have anything on it yet. If Emma has, I'm all ears. So, okay, great, thank you. So let's just talk very briefly about this last question, which relates to loss of information. So a lot of these prior questions that we were thinking about were ones where there was some sort of, I mean, not a malicious intent, but some sort of misconduct involved or a strong tendency towards bias, which is quite problematic. But I think we got to the stage where we looked at this diffusion network across multiple platforms and realized that there's a lot of information loss, even without negative actors or even without bad intentions. And I'm not using the best words here, but let me show you real quick the results so that we can potentially talk more about this. So when we look at how information is shared across multiple platforms, in particular, information about scientific articles, then unsurprisingly, we find that there's a propensity towards information loss over time. So the more time passes from the initial mention of the research article, the less information it contains. It's unsurprising in the sense that as novelty decreases, people are probably less likely to remember the details. Theoretically, everyone, these are not cascades where I'm taking the information from you and I'm passing it on. All of us could go back to the research paper, the abstract, and so on. And yet there's no, yeah, people don't do that. And there are many reasons for that not happening, but what we see is that there's a strong decrease in information loss, strong information loss over time. Now, when it comes to comparisons across platforms, we see that the most retention, here I'm showing you retention, so the higher the better, blogs retain the most information, followed by news, Facebook, Twitter, and Wikipedia. Now, this was interesting in many ways, surprising to us. It's not simply explained by the length of the text. So for this, we developed a measure that we validated with researchers who reviewed information retention in certain abstracts, in certain papers. And so our very simple computational measure was just quantifying the amount of key phrases retained in the mentions. And based on this very simplistic measure that yet has been validated, it seems like blogs contain the most nuance and the most retained information. Another thing that was interesting was when we looked at the number of platforms, we saw that if something was mentioned on one platform only, then the information retention was low. When we had two platforms, the information retention was higher. And then 3 or more platforms, so 3 to 5 platforms, had the highest information retention. And that's interesting because it tells us that on the one hand, if we were to look on just one platform, if we do the Twitterology type of science, we are missing a lot of the potentially interesting trends. But then it also tells us something about maybe these are very different papers that get that coverage across multiple platforms, or the sheer fact that they get that they are translated on many platforms manages to retain more. So it's super interesting. We want to look into that more next, just because we feel like the multi-platform discussions and the multi-platform component of this might be key in understanding information loss and misinformation more broadly. Okay, to summarize, and then I'd love to hear more questions. So to summarize, we try to get closer to something that has been prefaced 30 years ago and couldn't be more timely today. This need to engage with academic communities, but also with peer communities. This need for more diversity in who's producing science, but then whose results are visible. Ways to rethink science as quality control, and ways to communicate when things didn't go well. I feel like this will better equip us to understand how science is communicated on the web and how in a future perfect it should be communicated on the web. And then these are the main takeaways. I will not repeat them. I will thank, however, the team that has been behind this, and they are wonderful collaborators, wonderful people. So thank you to them, and all open. I'm open to questions.
Questions?
So I guess I have a couple of questions. One is a relatively simple one to start with. On the same thing I kind of asked about before, where you showed that there's all of these 0 or negative coefficients for women, different factors affecting women's visibility. The most negative I noticed was the maleness. I was asking about the difference between femaleness and maleness of the network, right? Mm-hmm. And is there a causal implication there? Like, does that mean that if women work more with men, there's a negative impact on their visibility? Do you think that's causal?
Well, I think that's one of the more twisted results there, because it does suggest to me that there's no winning game in collaboration for women in this particular case, because if you work with other women, they are more likely to be lower status, so you don't get the visibility, the boost because of that. If you work with men, there's a credit share problem. So the credit share typically goes, and there's some interesting research in economics on this, goes towards the men on the team. So you are in this catch-22, if you will, where you don't know how you, and clearly you should collaborate in all these models. If you just put in the number of people on the paper, then that's a positive predictor of visibility. So you should collaborate. It's just not clear how you do it. So I'm not, so after so many years doing this research, I'm not in the game of, of trying to see which one is worse. We are trying to see where, and I think the biggest takeaway from that exercise was that we go through so much mentorship and so many workshops. And I'm like, is this the best way to tackle this when we don't know? We look at the data and we cannot figure out what would be better. Maybe we could pinpoint in certain areas what's worse, but it was, I have a hard time dedicating time to a workshop that tells me that's the worst. Yeah, but I agree with you that that's one of the most striking findings there, that we still need to understand. And one thing that I just in the short talk I couldn't talk about, and maybe that's, so there was one last piece there that I found encouraging, and that's the fact that there are differences, inherent differences in the population of men and women on social media. Women are the younger generation, have less higher H index. So maybe that's part of this. So, and with new ways of trying to think about this, hopefully things will improve on the long run. But yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it is kind of on gender, so I'll go ahead. I was wondering about the self-promotion and again, how it leads to impact and other things, but there's also promotion through a lot of other means.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I am kind of wondering if institutes and universities and other people don't play a role. I mean, I feel uncomfortable sharing this over these networks, but if I go backdoor through somebody in a department or center or institute to share and promote that work for me, then it almost seems like a better route, you know, rather than blowing your own horn. But your thoughts on some of that?
Exactly. So two things there. That's an excellent point. One, we see from the data, that's a piece that I didn't mention here, but we have empirical evidence that institutions are better at promoting research than individuals. So overall, the structural virality of things started by an institution. In other words, your press release is higher than the structural virality of something you or your friends start for you. So I think going through institutions is one fix. Of course, it will not, since these inequalities are so systemic, it will not be a fix, because a full fix. So we still deal with the rest, but it's certainly in that particular small question, it's better to try to go through your institution. The second component of what you are saying, just having advocates, I totally just seeing this research and the findings, that's the way out. I don't know how you do that. That's another different conversation, but I think that's the way to go. We need to think about how to promote that, but rallying up allies and folks who understand this is essential. That's key. Yeah. Encourage that. Yes. Yes. And I've seen that publishers, very, very high, and so high impact publishers saying, oh, we invite you, but please put a junior person in your piece.
Thank you for the talk. Very comprehensive, industrious. You covered like a gazillion number of different research. My question was, and what shocked me was on your information loss results, which you seem to suggest that, well, your finding was that Wikipedia is extremely low. And I was shocked by it because then I immediately asked the question, okay, is it the mechanism of collective editing that contributes to this, or is it the functionality of Wikipedia, which is in a sense dumbing it down so there is this information loss to try to make it simplified for everybody?
So we haven't investigated all the possibilities, but I think the main driver will be that the Wikipedia article will be more person-focused. So it will not be, it will be an article about a researcher. The other, for instance, the blogs are much more likely to be on that article. So in the Wikipedia sample, just the way scientists use Wikipedia currently, it's more like, oh, here's this notable person, professor here and there, graduate student here and there, whatever. And these are the pieces they wrote. And you will see the title there, maybe a short mention, but essentially, and I was looking at this too, it was lower than Twitter. I'm like, what's wrong? So, you know, where are we? Yeah, where are we making a mistake? And no, it's just the way it's used. So it's less article focused and more person focused. Mm-hmm.
I have another question online from Emma. How do you think training in communication science online could be incorporated into curriculum for science students and postdocs?
Oh, that's an excellent question. For the past 2 years, I was involved in trying to create curriculum for the Civic Science Fellows group. This is a foundation supported effort to precisely to do that, train folks who have an interest in solving big scientific problems, but then also communicating that in new ways and more broadly. So I think it's something that we see good examples of also at some universities. I know Wisconsin has a really interesting effort there, but the big challenge with that is that the students so it's not universally adopted in the sense that not every student is equally likely to go to those. So again, you see a certain group of the students who will do that. So I agree with the question, trying to incorporate that in essentially each and every class to some extent, but without taking away too much space, airtime for from the actual material will be the solution, but it's certainly not easy.
There was actually one more question. What do you think is the role of press officers at universities or scientific societies in promoting people differently online? Within an institution, who chooses who to promote?
Another great question. We have not looked into this systematically, and I think there are, of course, differences so more resourceful institutions will be able to do that hopefully more comprehensively. Of course, there are the to-go people who always produce the interesting research, and then they are probably more likely to get chosen for these types of efforts. I don't know. And again, I think a more constructive way to tackle this is by educating everyone who's involved, who's touching this problem, so that they can more intentionally work against that.
Okay, with that, it's actually 1 p.m. sharp. So amazing. Thank you very much. I will see you guys next week. We have a Wednesday at NICO next week as well. Thank you.